Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. We encourage you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook and LinkedIn, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, hello again, everyone. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources and bios shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. Additionally, we will be offering closed captioning. There should be a button at the bottom of your Zoom doc, which will allow you to turn them on and off as needed. Also, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we start, I wanted to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. Next week on October 10th, we have an exciting doubleheader. First, a Crucible of Practice Salon at 12:30 Eastern Time, focused on what's working, CGLR communities with learning rich spaces, not learning Rick, in everyday places. That same day at 3 p.m., we'll have a conversation on what is next in learning recovery, national organization perspectives. And throughout the rest of October, we'll have exciting sessions with a funder to funder conversation on the 17th and two more very important Learning Loss Recovery Challenge webinars. Registration links and more information on these webinars will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. And joining you now is Hillary Jones with Foundations, Inc. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and thank you all for joining us as we start our session today, Taking Action, Accelerating Equitable Learning Recovery. And we've really come back to again and again at the Campaign for Grade Level Learning these NAEP scores and the reports after COVID-19 school closures and virtual learning and the learning loss that occurred. And even with recent reports that show that US students continue to significantly lag behind these pre-pandemic academic achievement levels. 2 weeks ago, our panel dug into these reports on the state of student learning in the US and posed a call to action of sorts for all those who care about early school success. And so please, if you missed any of our previous Learning Tuesday webinars, you can access them at the link I just shared. Last week, our panel of leaders of Catholic, urban, defense education, charter, and rural schools agreed that there's really a need for sustained and focused investment, for flexibility to pivot as there's big challenges, and for collaboration. And so today our panel is going to continue this conversation and look at what communities can do with this information. And so we want to say thank you as we introduce our panelists for today. We have Jean-Claude Brizard with us, who's the president and CEO of Digital Promise, a global nonpartisan nonprofit organization focused on accelerating innovation in education. We have Bruno V. Mano, a senior advisor for education with the Walton Family Foundation, and Michael Petrilli, who is the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, as well as writer and editor. And we welcome again our moderator for these sessions, John Gompert, a longtime leader in nonprofits and government organizations, and we're thankful for his work at the campaign always. And so, John, I'm going to pass the conversation over to you.
Thanks so much, Hillary, for all your help in putting this session together. I appreciate your help, and as always, a huge thank you to Sierra Sanchez for her wizardry that makes these sessions so seamless and such a success. I don't want to take much time for my comments today. We have amazing guests, and I want to maximize our time with them. And I hope those of you who've joined the session will join the conversation today early and often. And we will work hard to integrate your input as quickly as possible. Put your questions and your comments in the question and answer box, and we will see that we can integrate them into our conversation. We're very fortunate to have Mike, Bruno, and Jean-Claude with us today, and I encourage everyone to engage with them. Today, we're going to talk some about how we get unstuck on moving toward big positive change for young people, especially creating equitable learning opportunities for all young people. Specifically, we're going to explore the connected challenges of building sufficient will, building necessary knowledge, and sustained skill in implementing fundamental change that will ultimately lead to better learning outcomes and opportunities for every child. That's what our conversation today is about. I'm going to start with Mike because of his new leadership, his leadership of this new effort called A Generation at Risk, a call to action. So Mike, can you join us now?
All right. Hello, John. Great to be with you.
Thanks so much. It's so great to have you here. Before we get into the details of this new call to action, let's set a little bit of the context. There was an original report called A Nation at Risk, came out nearly 40 years ago. I think it was 1984. What happened with The Nation at Risk? What changed? And why did you feel the need for a new report now?
Sure. Thanks, John. Well, you're right. Actually, a little over 40 years now. It did come out in 1983. So this is a big anniversary. And, this was one of these reports where maybe we get used to reports these days. They land and maybe people pay attention to them or not. But this one really got the nation's attention. It turned out to be a blockbuster. And I think it captured a sentiment in the country that something was really going wrong with the traditional public schools at that time. It used this very strong language about the nation being at risk. Of course, I was only 10 years old at the time.
Oh, please, is that actually necessary? I'm sorry.
I know, but so here we go. But look, I was a kid of the 80s. It was the Cold War. We were terrified of nuclear war and of war with the Soviet Union. And so this report captured in these very vivid images this notion that it was as if one of our enemies had come in and infiltrated our schools and driven them to a level of mediocrity. That got people's attention. And it led to years and then eventually decades of work across the political aisle, left and right, Republican and Democrats in Washington and at the state level in trying to improve the schools. Now, to be clear, plenty of what came out of that was not necessarily smart policy or things that worked, but there was a sense that there was a problem, that we had a school system that we had inherited that was not as strong as it could be. There was a lot of focus at that time around the concern around mediocrity and not enough excellence. Over time, by the time getting into the 90s, I'd say there was more of the focus shifted to issues around equity and, achievement gaps, and clearly that we were not doing enough, especially for poor kids and kids of color. But over the course of the 80s, the 90s, into the 2000s, there was an education reform movement that was bipartisan and that was trying to do right by kids. And I would argue that made a lot of progress. Things did get better. Our schools got better than they were back when A Nation at Risk came out.
I love that. I want to get into the stall, and that then led to this new report. But when we say a nation at risk, when we say a generation at risk in the new report, say a little bit more about what you think is like. It's easy to wring our hands and say dramatic things, But say a little bit more when you say you're deeply concerned about education in America. What are the parts that you're really concerned about?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say that this bipartisan movement and effort, I would argue, came to an end. We could debate when that came to an end, but let's say 10 years ago, towards the end of the Obama administration, the country was becoming very polarized. You had the Tea Party movement, you had this populist backlash that I think was coming out of the financial collapse and the Great Recession. And then, of course, the Trump years just took the polarization and took it up to 100, right? Yeah. Then we had this terrible pandemic, awful, for everybody, especially for our kids. We're all in crisis mode. Suddenly, we're not seeing each other in person. We're doing this Zoom, which is great for events like this one, but it's not great for making relationships, maintaining relationships, having difficult conversations. And then more recently and into today, we're in the middle of this crazy culture war, where we're having fights about books and about how to teach American history and things that have, are very, very divisive. And all of that has made it much harder for people at the state and national level to work across the aisle on the meat and potatoes of trying to improve our schools. And of course, after the pandemic, with this terrible learning loss that you've been focused on in some of your webinars, plus the terrible mental health crisis, we have big challenges. And so we need people to come together and to try to find solutions. And yet, what are we doing? We're mostly just fighting. The media is very focused on those fights. There's not a lot of attention. So all that said, John, we brought a group together in this Building Bridges initiative. This was about 18 months ago to say, you know what, can we get some people left, right, and center, diverse group, to just get in the same room together again, talk about some of these issues, remind each other about, what is it that we care about from a deep, deep level, and see if over time, after spending more time together, we can rebuild relationships and maybe start to come up with a common agenda for going forward. And I'm happy to report we succeeded. I mean, we certainly were able to rebuild relationships. The old adage, spending time in person, it made a huge difference. But we also came out with this call to action called A Generation at Risk that tries to say, hey, we need to do much more than we're doing as a country for this generation of kids, while we also work on building the next education system going forward.
So that's a great setup. So what's it say?
So what does it say?
Where are these? I mean, we know all about, as you say, the areas of disagreement, how do we teach history, which books and so forth, all the issues that all the conflict entrepreneurs are dining out on, and the media, which has somewhat turned into a conflict entrepreneur in its own way, because this is where the cliques live. That's dominated the space, right? In many areas, we think there is an exhausted majority, that the people on the poles of these issues don't actually represent the majority, and that there is an area of agreement here. And you've tried to identify that area of agreement with respect to learning opportunities and education reform. So when you go through that process, what do you come up with? What's the heart of it?
So first of all, the report is at buildingbridgesaneducation.org. It's not very long, so people can take a look at it there. A couple of things. I mean, first of all, we all reaffirmed our belief in public education as a critical player in preparing citizens to participate in our democracy, as an engine of social and economic mobility, huge respect for educators and parents and the role that they play. The belief that, look, what we're trying to do is to make sure that every child has a chance to fulfill their potential. These are things, of course, we all agree around. Now, in terms of what a more responsive education system might do in the future, we want it to be firmly centered around students and their needs. And again, we can have huge debates about what it means to be a student-centered system, but that has big implications. Give parents and families real power. The people in this room certainly support at least public school choice, public charter schools. There's debate on the left and right about how far we go on school choice, but certainly parents should have real power in the system, and they need information also about how their kids are doing. And then to aim for a broader definition of student success than maybe we had in the previous wave of reform. And this is something, again, there's a lot of agreement on this, that test scores, academic achievement remains critically important, especially in the wake of the pandemic. But we all know that that's not everything, that all of us who are parents, we want much more for our kids than for them to read and write and do math. There's other subjects that are important. There's the social and emotional skills that are important. There are all the habits. And, great schools in our country make sure that they help prepare kids across all those different domains, and that kids can also get some of that done outside of school. And so we talk about how can we make sure that all families have access also to out of school opportunities to build those kinds of skills. So those are a little bit of a taste. None of this is necessarily groundbreaking, but it did demonstrate that even with people with very different views about politics and very different ideologies, we can still come together around some core ideas. Finally, I'd say, again, the urgency on this current generation. We need to, we cannot give up on this idea of these kids catching up. We have got to get them caught up, but they're not getting caught up fast enough. We've got to do the intensive tutoring. We've got to keep working on extending the year into summer school. We've got to give teachers the tools they need around curriculum and other things to be successful. We've got to be willing to level with the country that we're not getting the job done and have some measurement and accountability. So, and unfortunately, like I wrote recently in the New York Times, it feels like that conversation about learning loss, there's some of us having that conversation. There's certainly some educators and some policy wonks and practitioners, but at the highest level of our politics, it doesn't feel like it's being made a priority. We're just sweeping it under the rug. And meanwhile, these kids are marching through school and they're graduating and they're going on and they're not as prepared as they otherwise could be. And that is going to scar them. Certainly financially, it's going to scar them. We know that for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. The thing that you mentioned about politicians, I'm sure both of us read the piece that Mike Bloomberg wrote this. I mean, it was scathing, just a red hot indictment of political leaders for not taking this problem seriously enough. He had specific things that he thought should happen around summer learning,
right,
extended learning, all that. But the core of it was not like do what I think is the right thing to do. It's like pay attention, do something. This is a big problem. How do you think how do we get more of that? And I just have to say, all of this rings such a bell for me from an America's Promise perspective, because the genesis of America's Promise Alliance in 1997 was this sense like, oh, actually, we know the common sense things to do around kids. I mean, we had the list of the 5 promises, which aren't very different from what you just enumerated. But why is this not a greater priority?
Look, we are still in a political moment right now where all the incentives are for politicians in both parties to play to their base, and we see that. I mean, we see the Republicans mostly focusing on the culture wars, and fanning the flames of that. We see a Democratic president now who, is somewhat moderate on some issues, but when it comes to education, as he says, he is married to a member of the National Education Association. So, he has a traditional position on education that, felt traditional back in the day, but is not as comfortable with maybe calling out low performance as we saw from a President Obama or President Clinton, and so, part of this is whether the politics in this country are going to shift. Are we going to get back to a point where the parties are fighting for the center again? And I do think that will happen. I think that's the nature of politics, is that, this populist moment will burn itself out. People will want to see progress. And, you look around and you say, look, obviously, if we care about the future of the country, you got to make sure the schools are as strong as possible. And we're not getting the job done. The other thing I'd say, John, is that you do see at the state level some leaders stepping up, again, Democrats and Republicans. And of course, that is where most of the decisions are made. That is where the key action lies. And so that part is heartening. Now, sometimes those states aren't very bipartisan themselves. It might be a very red state or a very blue state. But you do see some places where governors are saying, very loudly, hey, we really need to do better by this generation of kids, but we need more of that.
Yeah, and I think a report like the call to action creates some safety and affirmation for those who would like to act and are, the loudest voices in the room are on the sides. So if you can create some volume for the voices of agreement, it makes it simpler for political leaders to enter that space. So, Mike, before we invite Jean-Claude and Bruno to agree and disagree with you. As you know, our network is largely made up of state and local coalitions who are working on early school success.
Right.
I'm curious, like, connect the call to action with what folks in the Campaign for Grade Level Reading network are doing. How is something like the call to action useful from a process perspective, from a political perspective, from a what exactly to do perspective? Talk about that a little bit, because I want information that is valuable to our network.
Well, when folks read the statement, I think they will find that there is quite a bit about those early years and the critical early years. We certainly talk about the science of reading. It's very exciting to see that have real momentum right now. And the challenge of helping kids who may have been in kindergarten over Zoom when the pandemic, was at its height, and how do we make sure those kids get the help they need? But I do think also the process is important. I mean, it sounds cheesy. I mean, it's like the stuff, everything I learned in kindergarten, right? But if you get in a room with people, not over Zoom, not on Twitter or whatever we're calling it now, not on social media, but in real live face to face, and you talk and you listen, you find out that, even these people that, are of the other political party, I may have assumptions about them and their views, but it turns out we still have a lot in common. And, people of goodwill coming together to get things done for kids. That is, I think, a message. So we certainly hope the folks that participate in this Building Bridges initiative, and they're fantastic, 20 people that just amazing. I think we all would love to see some people try to do this at a state level or a local level, or just finding ways and excuses to get people together in person again, several times, rebuild relationships, get to know one another. And not assume that because of the crazy politics that we might watch on TV that are coming out of Washington, that doesn't necessarily have to get in the way of getting things done out in the real world.
Yeah, I just want to encourage anybody who's got questions specifically about the call to action to post those now, and we can get into them. We can come back to them later as well. But if you've got a question about the call to action specifically, Mike, last question, I want to ask you to go a little deeper on process. Because if people are thinking, this would be helpful, like if we could get a coalition to state the principles of these are the things we believe in, these are the actions we think, and we could do that at the local level. And in some respects easier locally, because by definition, people are local, as opposed to flying in from people from around. So talk a little bit more about that, that getting to know, trust building, and then laddering up into specific recommendations.
First of all, we chose a group of 20 people. We thought that was about the right size. Any bigger than that, it would be hard. To have these more intimate conversations. We wanted to have a group where we get around a dinner table and talk. And so I think that was right. I certainly want to go bigger than that. We made sure it was diverse in all the ways that matter, including ideologically, but otherwise too. And we also made sure that we were choosing people who were focused on solving problems. We did not invite the conflict entrepreneurs into this one. There's a role for that. There are times when I like to spar with people and have a good debate, but people that have a reputation for maybe, wanting to just fight rather than find common ground, obviously that doesn't make sense for something like this. We ended up meeting 6 times over the course of a little over a year. So every couple of months, it was usually start with a dinner and then spend the day together after that. We did invest in having some great facilitators. We did some things at the beginning that was around getting to know you. Several of us, I'd say maybe half the group knew the other half of the group, and but there were a lot of folks that were new. And we kind of just let the conversation. We weren't too focused on getting to common statement right away. There was a lot of talking and listening at first. And then, by the 4th, 5th, 6th sessions, we started getting into, putting words on paper as part of the process. But yeah, it was a great experience. And if anybody wanted to reach out, I can certainly talk through some other ideas in depth.
That's fantastic. I think there are people who would be really, really interested in that. Bruno and Jean-Claude, can you turn on your cameras and hey, there you are. Thanks so much for joining. Fantastic. So both of you, I'm curious about what you think about the new call to action. Bruno, let's start with you.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here with everyone. I'm not going to dispute anything Mike said. In fact, I'll just build on that. So I have no fundamental disagreement with what he talks about. There are 2 or 3 things I'd like to briefly mention as a way of maybe extending some of the things Mike said. First of all, he started with a nation at risk, which is a good place to start. An interesting thing about a nation at risk, under the title A Nation at Risk, it had this phrase, an open letter to the American people.
Yeah.
Now that was really sort of pretty radical back then, because all of the multiple education reports that had come out before then had pretty much been a conversation between and among professional elites in the field. So a nation at risk was, from the beginning, attempting to do something else, which was widen the conversation and to get the American people to think about this issue in a way perhaps they had not been thinking about this issue before or involved in this issue before. So I think that's one important point to add to this conversation, that even though this was put together by 20 plus or minus people who probably are for the most part the kind we call policy wonks and all that, this conversation has to be broader than that. It has to be, to go back to Nation at Risk, a conversation with the American people that not only is a conversation, but then has built into it a process that involves their participation in this in some ways. And that can take a lot of shapes and forms. It can be employers, it can be parents, it can be families, it could be nonprofits, et cetera. But so this is in addition to what Mike said. That's one point. Another point, and this probably is considerably different than, I want to make a point about the political environment today, which is considerably different than probably the way it was way back when. There are, I want to make sure I have the right number here, 37 again, the political wonks call trifectas in state legislatures today. That is to say, 23 of them are controlled by Republicans. That means the governor's a Republican, the House and the Senate at the state level are Republicans, and 14 are controlled by Democrats. So built into this process, you have a very different political environment than you did 30, 40 years ago, where the legislatures and the governorship, executive and legislation, and you throw in the judicial, where you have a whole bunch of other issues. You've got a very different kind of political environment than you did back then, which creates a different set of issues that take me to a kind of my third point. And again, I won't talk in depth about any of these. We can come back to them if you want. So we have to think, I think, differently about what an education reform agenda is today compared to what it was 30 or 40 years ago. Mike is not denying that, so I'm not suggesting that he does. And embedded in what they say, he begins to suggest that. I've come up with a couple of phrases or ways of thinking about that might be useful to add to the conversation. A notion of opportunity and what I'd like to call opportunity pluralism, and then going along with that, implementation pluralism. Because when you have this changed political environment where you've got built into the agenda a red leaning and a blue leaning, you're going to have to allow a lot of room here for people to do things under the banner of red and blue. Now, we can talk about the extremes, but I'm talking more about the sort of ideological heartland as opposed to the conflict heartland that's more on the extremes. you have to think differently, I think, about opportunity and about pathways to opportunity. And so opportunity in my mind is a combination of both knowledge and networks. Young people have to know things, and then they have to have social capital and networks that help them as they advance through school and through adulthood. So there's a kind of knowledge and network, social capital, opportunity, pluralism, multiple pathways to opportunity, not just college for all, that I think needs to be part of this discussion. So those are my 3 points to kind of add, build.
Love that.
Okay.
Love that. I'm particularly interested in, I don't think you're in any way denigrating the effort of bringing policy nerds together. That's an important thing to do, but we also need demand from the public. Otherwise, you get this divorce of the elites from the people. And this was at the heart of what America's Promise was trying to do, and others have tried to do, what A Nation at Risk was all about. And when I think about the will, I don't think about the will of people who are deeply engaged in this and who have maybe slightly different ideas, but plenty of overlap to make lots of creative action and successful action, but actually the public demand for the kind of outcomes that we all seek. And that's, to me, one of the biggest barriers. So when Mike Bloomberg writes that piece, which I loved, it was just red hot, but politicians particularly mostly care about what people think. They want to do what people demand because they want to get reelected. People are not holding political leaders accountable for failing on this front. Okay, I'm coming back to you, Bruno. That was an awesome start. Jean-Claude, Bruno set a pretty high standard there. So tell me what you think. I know you're a signer of the call to action.
Yes, we are. And I'm not going to try to match Bruno. We are a signer because we believe in the report. We believe what was espoused. Just to add in, to be additive, a lot of what Mike said actually makes a ton of sense. The idea of connecting inside, outside of school. One thing we talk a lot about here is how do we make learning ubiquitous, and how do we capture learning the 365 days of the year. Our system is not set up for that. Learning does not have to happen between the walls of a school. Doesn't have to be during the day, but we don't have that kind of continuum, which I think can really do a lot to help close the kind of gaps we're actually looking to actually close. One important thing Mike pushed on was this idea of redefining success. I think that's one way of bridging the left and the right? So often we focus on math and reading proficiency as the goal. One thing I push, and a lot of us push, is that it's an important marker, but it's a means to an end. So really understanding what is exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. So we're finding, for example, economic mobility, well-being, personal agency. These are really fundamental principles on which we can actually build and understand that, again, getting kids ready to learn, getting kids learning and preparing for what comes after secondary to tertiary education is an important part of all this kind of work. Let me just maybe
Jean-Claude, hang on 1 second. You said 3 things. You said economic opportunity, you said well-being, and the third?
Was personal agency.
Agency. Yeah. Okay.
You
Great.
think about what allows people to actually navigate the world. I mean, that is an important construct, and how we should think about lifelong preparation for lifelong learning, lifelong success. But let me just put a finer point on this idea of the vitriol that exists right now in this country and what it's doing, frankly, to our schools and our school system. We have, as you know, a digital promise, this thing called the League of Innovative Schools. Right now, we have 155 superintendents of schools, a couple of charter networks who are part of our work. We're finding some amazing leaders, folks who are making a difference in the local systems, who are not just leaving the job, but leaving the profession, because they have school boards who are driving them absolutely crazy. In some instances, it's one person got elected, and they're spending 60, 70% of their time managing the politics and not necessarily doing the work of closing gaps in our schools. We're watching teachers, frankly, leaving the profession. So it is having a real impact on who wants to be a system leader, who wants to be in the classroom, who wants to lead a school. So we have to find a way, frankly, to create the conditions to allow these folks to do their jobs, which is educating our young people. And let me just add maybe I'm gonna add one report, which I think is a nice bridge to the report from the Fordham Institute. This is coming out of the Aspen Institute, and I was a part of this work as well, looking at this being a challenge to the future and the security of our nation. When you're looking at things like STEM education, that we're watching the Chinese really leapfrogging us, and in terms of like this kind of technology in STEM education, we need a world-class education system producing really the kinds of people who are leading the future, who are on the edge of technology innovation, really taking us again in ethical ways, right? Taking us where we need to be, and we're being left behind. Frankly, as a nation, so the security of our country, frankly, is at risk right now.
I'm really curious. There's a question about competency-based assessment of progress as opposed to sort of traditional school progress. But Jean-Claude, I want to come back to that in just a second. When you say redefining success in these three ways: economic mobility, personal well-being, sense of agency, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I think it's very consonant with what's in the call to action. Translate that for early school success. I'm very curious about that because vaguely we're probably thinking about economic mobility when kids are in the first and second grade, but we're thinking about that more when they're progressing. What are we thinking about foundationally that people can agree about? And maybe that's how we ended up with reading as the marker, and also a certain level of math skills, but those have limitations, so we know as well. Tell me how you think about that.
Absolutely, John. So let me just say there was one school district in California that just last spring held a conference in San Diego called the World of Work Conference. This school district is a P6, I believe a P6 or P8 school district. They don't have any high schools. So they are elementary schools. And for them to talk about what are the skills and competencies kids need to succeed, particularly their focus was, what do we do in early learning in elementary schools and middle schools to prepare kids to do really well in high school, to prepare them to do well in post-secondary, to access the future of the kind of work you find in San Diego County. That for me was an amazing competition. Of course, they focus on, again, skills and competencies, again, which include things like computational thinking, which include things like social emotional learning, because we know those are doable skills, right? That really get you to where you want to get to. But very simply, when you think about economic security, you think about the kind of living wage that people need. But again, more importantly, what are the skills you need to grow with a job, to change jobs, to grow with an industry, to be ahead of it. So when we talk about AI, which I think everyone right now is obsessed with, and you don't teach coding, you teach algorithmic thinking, because that gets you to leapfrog whatever the ChatGPT number is going to be in 14 years. When they get out of school, what exists now will not exist. So when you look at, for example, there's a great job now called prompt engineering, which is paying $300,000 to $500,000, by the way. If you read the job descriptions, little about the knowledge of coding, because they know AI is already coding, right? So what are the skills you need to access that kind of future, I think is what they were thinking about in this particular construct.
That's really interesting. Bruno, I want to come back to this question of public will determination. I mean, Jean-Claude just painted, a sort of a nation at risk, a 40 years ago kind of picture. In your view, I mean, you spend a lot of time thinking about this. Why is it that people aren't more concerned, upset, activated? And then I'm curious how Mike, you think maybe the report contributes to this, but this is a long time question for me, and I don't really know the answer. Like, yeah, it's not good, it's all bad. Like, It's not all bad, but there's a lot that's bad. And it's fixable. Like, people know what to do. So why is it that people aren't more concerned?
Well, in my simple way of thinking about things, and then I can give some examples, we've got a major information problem.
Mhm.
And just let me illustrate that in a couple of ways. Take the question of, keep it simple, pandemic learning loss. If you ask parents how well their children are doing in school right now, they think they're doing great. There's like almost 80% will say my kid is on grade level.
Yeah.
Now, we know the reality is far from that. So and another way of thinking about the information problem, Gallup, this is data from Gallup. So, nonpartisan, no one is trying to make a point here other than to just report what the situation is. Gallup's most recent report on what the American public thinks about education shows a large gap between what the American public at large would think about education and what parents think about the education of their oldest kid. I mean, a significant gap. Gallup, I don't want to misquote it here, so I have it here just to make the point.
Excellent.
Here's what Gallup says. 42%, this is the American public at large, say they are satisfied today with the state of American education. That's the lowest measure in the past 2 decades by 1 percentage point, and the second lowest reading in Gallup's 23-year trend. Compare that with, at the same time, parents of children attending kindergarten through grade 12 remain largely content with their oldest child's education. 80% are completely or somewhat satisfied. So we've got a lot of these, I call them information gaps, disconnects between reality and what people perceive, almost to the point where there are a bunch of collective illusions about what's going on. Now, there's no simple answer to what to do other than to say we need some sort of very fundamental steps about, this is a message, as go back to A Nation at Risk, to the American public, an open letter to the American public about the state of the current situation, which is not hopeless. That's not the point here, to be hopeless.
Right.
The point is, let's do a reality check. And then and there are ways forward. There are ways forward. Let's do a reality check, make sure we're all on the same page, because right now we are living in different worlds. There is a kind of collective illusion about and I can understand why 80% of parents like to think their kids are at grade level.
Of course.
John, can I give you a quick use case on this, on what Bruno
Please.
just said, which I think is important? I was in a meeting with CCSs, or Chief State School Officers in DC a few months ago, and they had a parent from a district nearby, I won't mention which one, speaking, and when a child transferred school, she was told her kid couldn't read. And she goes, how can that be? She got all A's for the past 4 years. So she's like, you telling me my kid is getting an A in every subject area, but you tell me she can't read. What the hell? So when you think about that kind of disconnect, there goes, I think, some of the foundation Bruno's talking about. We have an information challenge. It's not just public, but what is happening within our school system. What we're telling parents sometimes, frankly, is a false set of information for kids.
And
Agree.
I'll flip something here just to make my other point. The situation isn't hopeless. Far from it. A month or so ago, the Albert Shanker Institute of the American Federation of Teachers, the so-called, whenever you say AFT, everybody thinks, not everybody, but many will think bad boys. So they're actually not bad boys here, or girls, or whatever pronoun you want to use. Put out a very interesting report on the reading legislation that has passed red and blue states the last, I think, 3-4 years, 200, some 100 odd bills. And they're all in the ballpark of what the science of reading says. That's a huge change. And, so I do think there is hope here. but it has to start with the recognition of reality. With even the AFT saying, we've got a bipartisan consensus on what it does to help young people read. So there is a problem, but I think there are solutions.
Mike, I think that's part of what's powerful about the call to action is one of the things that is most defeating in motivating people is in the sense that we can't do anything. Either the problem's too big or the problem's intractable. It fits with a deep narrative in sort of the way people in America think. There might be some undercurrent of sort of Darwinistic thinking, but I don't think that's really what it is. It's really just more like it's too big, it's too hard. We tried this, we tried that. Everything's getting worse all the time. We're saying, oh, the test scores are worse than they've ever been, and people throw up their hands like I'm throwing up my hands. I think that maybe the call to action is a little bit of an antidote to that. I'm curious how you think about what Bruno and Jean-Claude have said.
No, well, I hope that's the case. Look, I think it's important also to remind us that we've made progress in this country. I mean, I talked about the history here. From the 90s into the 2000s, there was tremendous progress on those test scores, right? Especially in math, especially in the early years, but also in reading. But it was particularly focused on the lowest achieving kids. We took the number of kids, the Black students, for example, who were learning below basic on NAEP, went from something like 2/3 to less than half. I mean, it was still too high, but it was dramatic progress. And it was because of a whole bunch of things that were going in the right direction. The changes in education policy, more resources, greater accountability, also lowered child poverty rates, good things happening outside of schools. All of that stuff made a difference and things got better for kids. And so I think it's important to remember that, to say, hey, okay, this wiped out 20 years of progress, but we say that, think about that. There was 20 years of progress. And so now, and it's awful that this pandemic happened. We can regret some of the decisions that were made during that very confusing time. Now, though, let's get back to those things that worked, and we've got good, we know some things that do work. The science of reading works, giving teachers great high quality instructional materials so they can be effective, that works. Having more time on task through tutoring or extended learning time, long, after school, Saturdays, during the summer, that works, and we can point to some places that are starting to turn things around. So I think you're right, John. We need to be careful not to make it feel like it's impossible. This point about what parents know, though, I mean, if there's one thing educators could do, it would start by saying, tell parents the truth. Stop giving A's to kids who are not doing A-level work, and the fact that, as far as we can tell, test scores have collapsed and grades have not. That's a problem. That is why parents don't see there's a problem. Now, parents will say that they understand there's a mental health crisis because they hear their friends talking about it. They know that some of their friends' kids are struggling, with these issues. They're fired up about the culture wars because they hear about, various policies schools are adopting that might sound, new and different to them, right? But they're not hearing stories about their own kids or their friends' kids suddenly getting Fs, or at least Cs and Ds after the pandemic. So that, to me, is a huge, that's what we parents pay attention to. We get, just while I'm here on the webinar, I'm getting alerts coming from my kids' schools about the latest assignments that got graded. That's what we see all day long. We don't see the test scores, and we see the 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10. And the perception is everything's going fine. So, if we're going to change that perception, we got to start telling the truth.
So I agree with that, but I also, going back to Bruno's point a minute ago, trust in these institutions is low. And so doing accountability in a context where there isn't trust that doesn't go very well, right? It leads to even greater fissures. And so it can feel like a scold. It can feel like you're doing a bad job, not we're doing a bad job, and it feels like people aren't on the same side. Schools aren't on the side of the teachers. Teachers aren't on the side of the kids, and resolving that. So that's part of why I like the structure in the call to action, because I think it can help to resolve some of those things. But those tensions are real, and particularly in communities that have not thrived as much for a whole bunch of complicated reasons. Trust is low, and dealing with schools is very, very complicated. And to be told that your kid is not doing well, that is a hard message to receive. And it's a hard message to deliver in a way that is optimistic.
I think that's right. But John, I would push a little bit to say, here's a moment where we can say, look, it's not your fault. I mean, it was a pandemic, none of us knew what to do. Things happened, schools closed for a long time. Of course, kids lost ground, they weren't in school. So we're not blaming the teachers. We're not blaming, anybody. We're not blaming the kid. It happened, so now there's an opportunity. So another example of what we could do, we've got kids, especially in these early grades, who are further behind than ever. Well, I've been arguing that we should have a conversation about having some of those kids repeat kindergarten or first grade or second grade or third grade, be more aggressive with those retention policies than maybe we otherwise would be. Now, we know from the research, it's got to come along with a lot of interventions. You don't just do the same thing. But, and you might want to do it not just one kid at a time. You might have a whole class of kids. It could be, maybe we need a whole bunch of kids to go and have, instead of go from second grade to third grade, they go to grade 2.5. And we give them that extra time. We give them the time back that they lost during the pandemic. And again, maybe in normal time, we fear that there's a stigma to retention, to holding kids back. It's not a normal time. It's nobody's fault. This happened and it's affecting a ton of kids. So I think we have this moment now, it's passing. And if we don't act now, I think we're going to look back and regret that we weren't more aggressive.
So can I add a bit, maybe,
please.
Not a counter, but maybe somewhat additive to what Michael was talking about. There's also a new set of pedagogies that we also need to understand about how kids learn too, which frankly, we didn't really understand a while ago. I shouldn't say that. The schools of psychology, I've always understood that, but never talked to the School of Education, right? So the two are separate. The idea of really understanding how kids learn, I think can even help us with the 50% that we had in the past before the pandemic. So we've done well, to Michael's point. Well, we've done sufficient work, good work, but not sufficient work, even going back before the pandemic. I'm putting an article in the chat for everyone that I co-authored recently on how to close the math achievement gap, which leans within. I co-authored with a learning scientist who is focused on how kids learn. Former math teacher in Denver Public Schools, PhD in mathematics, really focuses on this kind of effort. I keep pushing this because we have 50 learning scientists on staff here at Digital Promise who all they do is look at math, science, reading. They look at, again, the things, employment, innovation, how do we connect all of the pieces together? So when you think about what we've learned from the school psychology, so some of the what we call social emotional skills are foundational to developing skills and competencies within kids. Some are prerequisite for the kind of learning we want to see in math or reading. Science and reading is popular, but there's also a lot done in other subject areas as well too, which I think can help propel us even faster in trying to close the gaps. But what hasn't really happened to a scaled level is getting that kind of information on how to teachers and to curriculum developers, to pedagogical folks. So we are understanding this at the macro level. There's a lot of work happening within school systems. By the way, one of my favorite places to go to is Talladega County, Alabama, rural school district that is now 98% completion rate in high school. They have adopted this. It took them 7 years to implement. One of the best school districts I've ever visited in 35 years in this business. Again, not a sexy big city, but a rural county in Alabama. Fantastic work. But when you see the leadership, you can see how deliberate they are in the integration. Again, the idea of connecting the science of development, science of learning to real pedagogical work in our schools could be a really good way of us really trying to accelerate the work we do on proficiency.
Bruno, I want to come to you for a second, because coming off of Jean-Claude's comment, when we talked earlier, you talked about we should know and document a few things that are crucial to accelerating learning opportunities for all kids and creating the right kinds of environments. Michael named some, and they're in the paper. You had talked about your concern that actually people don't know, or in lots of places, people don't know what are the right steps to take. And maybe this report can be helpful in that respect, that we should narrow and focus on a few steps that really have been shown to be efficacious in creating the kind of conditions and outcomes we're looking for. Can you talk about that for a second? The knowing what to pursue.
Yeah. As a way of answering your question, let me do a prelude, and then I'll put the
Fine.
answer in the context of the prelude here. And it goes back to one of the themes that we've all talked about, which is this is not just a school problem or a problem to be solved by teachers, educators, schools, SEAs, LEAs. You know, this is a community problem that we all need to participate in solving. And yes, the school district may take a lead, et cetera. So I would think about this as a sort of community-wide endeavor, community-wide project that has a couple of steps to it. The first step would be, and this is almost like a way to think about developing a community recovery strategy to tie this into the theme of the conversation. We need to start by communicating there is a problem, and that is a theme that we've all talked about endlessly so far, and communicate what that problem is. And then this sort of euphemism, develop a plan. Okay, and here's where a lot of these strategies and tactical things come into play. And this is probably where educators do have to take a lead role in laying out whether it's science of reading, high quality curricular materials, summer school, high intensity tutoring, all these sort of strategies that we do know work in different ways, but that need to be implemented, you know, in a consistent and serious strategy. We need a sort of plan that brings these things together. Coming out of that, I think this would be the sort of accountability part of that, a community-wide report card that enlarges, to go back to another thing that we've talked about, our meaning of success. It's not just about raising test scores. That's an important part of it. But Jean-Claude talked about the three dimensions of success. There's economic mobility, there's self-agency, and I forget the middle one in between.
Well-being.
Okay, thanks. But a way of thinking about what success means and then tracking our progress towards success. And then the hard part is then focusing all the resources, not only of the school system, which means the financial and human resources of the school system, but the community resources that are available on, you know, sort of implementing this plan. So that was a long-winded answer to your question.
Not at all. It wasn't long-winded. Let me press you on this for a second, because I think you're saying something without saying it explicitly, but I'm going to push you and see if this is right. There's something about a fundamental and to some people scary power shifting that you described, that this actually needs to be owned by the community. The plan needs to be owned by the community. The accountability needs to be owned by the community. Right now, accountability seems like it's, you know, a lot of people like this looking over their glasses and scolding, and they come from the feds, and we know how everybody loves the feds, and it's tied to funding and tied to very specific kind of activities. And what you're talking about, and what I think is so interesting for the people listening in this call, is really a power shifting kind of thing. And if you think of communities that have all kinds of people in them, that all kinds of people need to own this, that is a big deal and could make a huge difference, and more likely to happen on a community by community basis than on a state basis or on a national basis.
No, I agree totally. And it gets back to where we start. You know, the Nation at Risk was an open letter to the American people. All right.
Yeah.
This is not just the job of teachers or educators, though there's a clear role for them. It is a community job, a community-driven job. Yeah.
Yep. And
It is about power shifting. And
it is
that causes problems.
and the community coalitions that make up the bulk of the Grad Nation, I mean the Grad Nation, also that, but the campaign for grade level reading, that's trying to grab some of that and channel it. And it's not just accountability, it's also support. Sure, you need accountability that this works, but you also, it's hard. This is hard to do. These kind of changes are hard to implement, and it requires community support. If it's being done against the will, it's being imposed on the community. Well, we can predict how that's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, my shorthand way of doing that, and then I'll be quiet. It's not just about knowledge in the narrow sense of the word. It's about networks. It's about social supports. It's about social capital, in addition to cognitive knowledge and all the things that go along with that. All right, I said I'd be quiet.
No, Bruno, I couldn't agree more. I mean, yes, we need student level measures. We need to understand what is happening in schools and school districts and CMOs, right? That kind of accountability needs to exist. Yes, and support, to your point, John. What we've not talked about often enough in our sector, in our work, is the system level measures. How are we creating the conditions for success for young people? The Schott Foundation has the Loving Cities Index as one example of all of that. We have to look at that. The other, which is an important point, the Racial Equity Institute, in their metaphor, their white paper on the fish and the groundwater red metaphor, looked at data across sectors in different states across the country. What they found was parallel lines. If you look at criminal justice involvement, health disparities, achievement gaps, all of it really paralleled. So if you want to attack this, you have to attack it in a comprehensive fashion. And there are folks who are doing that across the country, or beginning to demonstrate results. One of my favorite, frankly, is the Commit partnership, COMMIT partnership in Dallas, who have this, again, I'll use the expression collective effort approach to really moving kids to and through from early learning. By the way, their initial work started with early learning. Now they are P, or even before P, all the way to economic mobility. That's the way in which, well, another way in which we can look at resource deployment, resource braiding, to really allow for the kind of what we want to see in our communities.
Yeah, Mike, what do you think about what you're hearing from Jean-Claude and Bruno about this sort of the physics of change here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, I think the conversation is right about the broader measures and these aspirations we have that are much bigger. And yeah, this is about changing the way power works. I would say though, like, you know, I think I argued this in the New York Times. You know, I think we have had a period recently where there's been a big focus on doing more helping, adding more capacity to the system, you know, not doing as much of the old style accountability, you know, and I think that was appropriate. I think we needed that. We had pushed the No Child Left Behind style accountability as far as we could. And it was, we realized that the system, the way the system was responding, there were a lot of people out there who wanted to do right by kids, but they did not have the tools and resources to do so. So we have been focusing on that. Higher standards, stronger curricular materials, you know, better support for teachers, just more money back in the 2010s, and then with the response to the pandemic. I do think it is time to say we've got to combine all that. We got to keep doing that, but we also need some tough love again. and we need to be willing to say, to call out, again, speak the truth. If there are some schools that are not getting it done, we've got to say that, and we've got to start being willing to take some tough action again.
Jean-Claude, what's your reaction? Oh, go ahead, Bruno. Then
Well,
Jean-Claude.
Just to make that point from another perspective, everyone has probably heard about Mississippi's experience with reading.
Yeah.
Which had in it a third grade retention requirement. Now, kids had up to 3 times to take the test, and there were a lot of, if you had certain disabilities, there were ways around it. But it had in a requirement that you had to pass a test, and there were ways around it. There was an interesting, I have the article here, I'll name it so that they can put it in the chat.
Great.
The effects of retention under Mississippi's test-based promotion policy. An analysis done of what happened to the kids who were held back, and they followed those kids up into the 6th grade. And what they found were that retention under the policy had no significant impact on other outcomes in 6th grade. And the kids who were retained actually ended up doing better at the 6th grade level than those who were let through the system, and who were just on the edge. They were just below, their test scores were high enough to pass, but just at the bottom part of the thing.
Yeah.
The kids who were retained did better than those kids by the time they got to 6th grade. So there are important things that we've come to know about what something like accountability means, which may seem harsh up front, but does have long-term consequences. And in this case, it wasn't just one time. You had 3 times to pass the exam. They ended up actually retaining something like 6 to 8% of the kids. So it wasn't that 50% were held back.
Yeah.
So, some of this sort of fact-based analysis gives us some insight into what the effects of these policies are that we have accountability on the accountability. But you also have to make Mike's other point, resources, capabilities were poured into this program.
Yeah.
It wasn't just swim.
Jean-Claude, I'm curious how you think about accountability without having the punitive feel to it. I mean, it's the same for everything. How do you do evaluations of employees without it feeling punitive? All the, we don't love feedback. None of us really love feedback all that much. So how do you do accountability, which is kind of a look over your glasses, in a skeptical way, word even, accountability is, in a way that doesn't feel punitive, particularly to communities that have had all kinds of struggles, and it's easy to judge them harshly.
Yeah, I've been told feedback is a gift. I agree, John. I don't know. I wear my heart.
Yeah, but sometimes you return gifts. Sometimes you get the wrong gift
but
and you take it back.
And sometimes you need to hear it too, right?
Yes,
I think that's
true.
important. So one thing quickly on retention, which aligns to my overall comment, is I met once in Brooklyn, New York, a 14-year-old who was in 6th grade. And the kid was completely depressed, right? That tells you something. The kid was a special needs kid, that the accountability was on the kid, not necessarily on the system and the people responsible for this kid's success. So my point very simply is that when we have to think about accountability, yes, we have to talk about resources to support the entire chain to do better, but we also have to hold folks accountable at different levels of the system. Hence my expression before on systems level measures, because, it's the school, it is the classroom, it is the school system, it is the state education department, it is the feds. How do we think about this idea of community? Just quickly, one thing that Michael Fullen wrote an article maybe 10 years ago called The 3 Stories of School Reform: the inside story, the inside outside story, the outside inside story. So it is not a one-dimensional sort of construct, right? It really is looking at the entire soup to nuts. Are we holding everyone accountable for the success of our learners? That for me is really, really important to think about.
So I think this question of accountability is also related to the area I wanted to explore with you a little more, Jean-Claude, which is about implementation. accountability can lead to oh, it's not working, throw the bums out, or I quit, I'm out. And then you get the churn in schools. When you mentioned Talladega, the thing that you called out was they stuck at it for 7 years. So our friends who are on this call, they're leading community coalitions. I think many of them have just what Bruno suggested, which is like, here's the menu of things that need to get done, and we're here to support you for those actions. And those actions are very similar to what Mike identified in the call to action. And yet the patience isn't there. There's an expectation that somehow you're going to do high dosage tutoring in a pretty good way, and it's all going to be great in a minute. We know it's not going to all be great in a minute, yet we have very, very high expectations, and we drive people, as you were saying, out of jobs. So talk a little bit about high quality implementation, how people like the folks on the call today can support high quality implementation while doing some accountability in there too, and how we can sustain action, because I think we do have a sense that there are, you name it, 5, whatever things that we ought to be doing in a sustained way. How can we help people stick to it like Talladega did?
So let me start perhaps with a more macro view of implementation.
Great.
I have a colleague in Melbourne, Australia, who was tasked when he was at Deloitte to put 500,000 people on the same page. And they developed as a team this thing called the As One curriculum, which leans on these 3 Bs, right? To get the behaviors, you need a big, bold vision that folks can rally around, and you need a sense of belonging in that vision. Then you get the behaviors, the 3 Bs we're talking about here. So that's an important construct to think about in terms of this idea of sustainability, because when you have ownership and belonging in the vision, you're going to fight for it, which may require the kind of community approach, making sure you're curating the right table and understanding how you design this idea of a big goal that folks can actually write. It could be 3rd grade literacy as the big goal, for example. I'm watching that happening in parts of the country. But there are tools that we know are critical too in understanding implementation. Too often in school systems, we throw spaghetti at the wall, right? And if it doesn't stick, then we shoot new spaghetti at the wall. So they
mostly on top of the old spaghetti. We don't even clean the wall. It's just like more.
So I'm thinking about even my work in Chicago and Rochester, New York, in thinking about how we implement work. For example, I saw with Rochester when Common Core was coming out, we put 60 lead teachers in the room, and we took the existing curricula, and we worked together in redefining how to move that to Common Core level. And because it was built by teachers for teachers, the union couldn't attack it as a structure because it was their work. That's an important piece of the work. Once you develop that, there are things like driver diagrams that we know exist, plan, do, study, act cycles that exist, will all come back to this idea of continuous implementation, continuous improvement. You have a deliberate set of strategies from a root cause analysis allow you to get to where you want to get to. That is an important way of making sure you're being deliberate in your action. You're learning from test, from the iteration that is required. All these kinds of mechanisms exist that folks actually adapt, like driver diagrams, that really allow folks to do that. But fundamentally, you got to go back to this idea of rallying a community against the goal and making sure that different layers of the organization or the community have that kind of belonging in that vision. If you do that, you're going to get behaviors, you're going to get sustainability in the process.
Mike, it strikes me that what the call to action did was help to create a space for just what Jean-Claude it was talking about. Like, oh, there's wide agreement about aspirations. We don't have to actually fight about aspirations so much. We might articulate them in slightly different ways, but we don't have to fight about aspirations. And there's pretty wide agreement about a few pretty fundamental measures or strategies to pursue the kind of outcomes we want. I'm curious just how we can all work together to use the call to action to create a safe zone, to commit like a permission. Like, yeah, these are the right things. A bunch of experts from all kinds of different views agree on this. So now we don't have to debate about that. And this goes to what Bruno was saying as well. Now we can focus on how to do this, how to support this happening and require that it happens and so forth.
I like that notion of a permission structure. I think that's right. And to also try to keep in mind, try to see where we have those common sentiments about what we're trying to achieve, and focus there, and then have the debates about the policy wonk details, right? So, for example, we're having a big debate in this country about how far school choice should go, education savings accounts. That's an issue that's certainly dividing along traditional political lines. It's one thing if you think that the people who favor education savings accounts are trying to, destroy the public schools, right? And I understand there's some people who are listening here might think that's the case. If you listen to those advocates, though, I generally find that that's not their interest. They really believe in the parent empowering, and they believe in this broader measures of student success. They want to have poor kids have opportunities to do things outside of school, like tutoring and enrichment and sports that rich kids get to do, right? Now, that doesn't mean I agree with those advocates about that particular policy. Personally, I'm not a big fan of some of these education savings accounts. But if I can understand where they're coming from, and I can see that they have some of the same goals that I have, and they're not these cartoon villains that we make up in our head, maybe that means we can find some common ground. So for example, maybe we don't like the idea of traditional education funding flowing to these education savings accounts, but maybe there could be broad-based agreement on something like an enrichment savings account, where we find new money outside the K-12 system that could support after school, weekend, summer school kinds of things, so poor kids can get to, have a rich menu of opportunities in that out of school time, that affluent kids take for granted today, and maybe that is something where you could get bipartisan support. I mean, I think that's where we start saying, okay, there are some threads here that we could weave together.
Bruno, I see you slightly reacting there. So go ahead.
No, my reaction is positive.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It was not negative.
All right.
Sierra, I think, Mike, just to add and connect it to something, I think, the political reality today is we got a lot of red states that are trifectas, and we got some blue states that are trifectas. And you've got to deal with those, the real political situation, which will, there's going to be implementation pluralism. It's just a fact of life. There are always going to be, and I'm in the school of thought that says actually there is a consensus, an ideological heartland that's not a place, but it is a sort of place in the sense of where most people gather and agree on things. And there are always things on the edges that are just that, on the edges. So let's focus more on that sort of ideological heartland, where, again, to use the euphemism that some political scientists do, there's kind of domestic realists who are willing to work in this world where we have pluralistic approaches to how we implement and go about doing things within the context of, a community agenda.
To be sure, I think there are in that some non-negotiable things, but I think that the non-negotiable things are actually incorporated in the call to action. So the focus on equity, which is for the campaign, is central, is absolutely in there, and I think an important accomplishment, and for the group, the Building Bridges group, but also what you and Jean-Claude have said about some states that people think of as red states that have actually taken a great deal of action that is equity focused over the past several years in a sustained way, producing real results. So that's, I think, encouraging. Sierra, I want to there you go. You're ahead of me, of course. Please, for those who are with us, fill out the poll because this is really important to us in terms of what people like, continuous improvement in these sessions, meeting people's needs with these sessions. So thanks for filling that out. And as folks are filling that out, I just say, I think what we're talking about today is how to launch and successfully sustain what you might call the next chapter of broad-based action to create favorable learning conditions for every child, with a special attention on how to be more successful in meeting the needs and aspirations of young people who are growing up in more perilous circumstances. How do we do that? So I want to give each one of you a couple of minutes for some final words of wisdoms about how we create the environment that demands that kind of action and that supports that kind of action. How do we generate like that right combination of ironclad determination combined with knowledge of smart strategies, combined with sustained high quality implementation? To me, that's the magic. I think this all can be done. I think communities are up to it, and the folks in our network, that's exactly what they want to do. And it feels like we wanted to talk about the call to action because we think it's a great moment for this. And I think all of us are kind of hungry for not the great unlock, because that's too much magical thinking, but like, how do we move in this direction? I think that's what everybody in our network is looking for. How do we have that ironclad determination to do the things that are smart strategies and stick with it over time? Jean-Claude, I'll start with you. You and I have had many conversations about this, so I know you're always ready. If I called you at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd be ready with an answer for that. So I'll start with you.
Just spent 2.5 days in Bailey, Colorado, with 59, 60 amazing leaders in education. That was part of our conversation about how we think about leapfrogging inequality, to paraphrase Rebecca Winthrop at the Brookings Institution. So one is this idea of ironclad determination. I think the information flow, the understanding that this is about the future of a nation, I think is an important push to keep pushing and keep messaging. But the idea of belonging in that vision is important too. So getting, again, diverse communities. And by the way, I think there are constructs where the left and the right will come together. Again, albeit initially for different reasons, but the initiative is similar. One example of that is the learning and employment record, the LER, the movement pushing, frankly, for a different structure around capturing learning. You know, some of the folks on the far right, it's about homeschooling. It's about, again, a kind of micro school homeschooling stuff. For others, frankly, it's about making sure that learning is being recognized for the most at-risk young people. So that, I think, is an important part of the work. The other, I'm going to say two more things, maybe, John. The second is, I think the AI revolution, again, it's not new, 50 years in the making, hockey stick in the last couple of years, I think opens real possibilities around leveraging the technology to help us really understand and move education forward. For me, which also aligns, and I've just put a link in the chat, which aligns to work we do at the Digital Promise based on Todd Rose's work around learner variability. Everyone has a jagged learner profile. How do we get personal with each student? Very difficult to do with 34 kids in the classroom with a single teacher, right? But if we rethink the mental model for teaching, if we, by the way, ASUs on top of this, if you think about this idea of learner variability and technology, there's a way to do that in a way that really responds to every child, including neurodiverse kids. I think that kind of understanding of the learning science, science development to help us understand how kids learn, and AI and tools can help us do that. The last thing, which I think is really important, which we don't do very well, is disciplined implementation. The idea of learning from the kind of iteration that happens and refine. I'm a commercial pilot. I tell people the NTSB is the best invention in aviation. Why? Because no incident goes without investigation to inform the larger system in getting better at what it does. This is why aviation is so safe, because all that happened before is part of the record, part of the implementation improvement work. We have to bring that kind of mentality, the Six Sigma. Failure is unacceptable to education. We have it in aviation, more or less in medicine. We allow and accept failure in education. That cannot be something we actually allow. There are ways of implementing stuff and bring those kinds of understanding to the work we do in education.
Outstanding. I told you, everybody, that he's got the answer to that. 3 o'clock in the morning. Bruno, curious for your final pearls of wisdom on how we create that.
Before I give you the answer, Jean-Claude mentioned someone, and I would suggest people maybe look at one thing in particular. Mentioned Todd Rose's work. They have actually a pretty interesting thing called the American Education Index, and you might want to put that in the chat there. That tackles this issue of collective illusions that we have about education. And we're much more in agreement than we are in disagreement on a vast majority of issues, particularly when it comes to the sort of fundamental purposes all people have for K-12 education. So if folks have not seen that, they might take a look at that. So then to answer your question, I'd come back to something I'd said and sort of summarize and answer your question based on something I said before. And that's, I think a community recovery strategy has 4 key parts to it, 4 key elements to it: honest information, a community plan that talks about roles and responsibilities, what will educators do, what will employers do, what will nonprofits do, et cetera. A report card that tracks progress to the goals that are part of that plan, not just academic goals, but these sort of social support goals that we want to build into our process. And then finally, laser focus of resources on accomplishing that plan, and not just the resources that are part of the K-12 system, but the resources that are part of the community. So that's sort of a way of summarizing.
That's a really good blueprint. And Mike, to follow Jean-Claude's theme there, I'm going to invite you to safely land the plane.
Oh boy, we'll see. Look, yeah, building on what both Jean-Claude and Bruno said, I think that we do have especially an opportunity in this community with the early years focus on reading. There is momentum around the science of reading, and we should not take that for granted. It's really wonderful to see it. And it's bipartisan. It's so far has not been politicized. Of course, there's some controversy, but for the most part, it feels like it's a moment where we have the ability to focus on good practice and stick with it. But again, this is one of these areas where we've got to stay the course. And the temptation will be to move on to the new shiny thing quickly. And I think the challenge for us nationally, state, and at the local level is to try to, just keep doing this work. And it's that, John, and you said it, it's that tough work of implementation, step by step. It's not necessarily sexy, but it does make a difference. And if you have those report cards like Bruno's talking about, and you can see that we're starting to make progress, we're starting to get kids back to where they were, maybe we highlight some places that are doing a particularly good way, good job, we can keep it going in that direction.
Well, I really agree with that. First of all, I bet everybody who's on this webinar has gotten a email from Ralph Smith at one point or another and knows that his signature line says, "Stay the course." So there you go. That was well played. I think that your last point, Mike, and others made it in different ways in the course of this conversation, about a narrative of possibility and success, a more optimistic view that things are possible, change is possible, like we can act differently, and different outcomes are possible, is just such an important story, because there's a counter narrative of we've tried everything, we're throwing up our hands, we're exhausted, we've spent all the money, nothing's better, and we quit. So I think it behooves leaders like you all to also tell that positive story. The agreement around, here are some actions that are really, here are some aspirations upon which we agree, here's some actions that have high efficacy, is really, really important, matched with a story of possibility. And I think the times when we have moved the polity, political leaders to action, have been those times when not only are we calling out urgency, but we're saying there are things you can do, and we could agree or disagree about those specific things, but it's important to take action and feel like there's a possibility, a real possibility of big success. So with that, I just want to thank our amazing, wonderful guests today. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have all of you join us. Love the conversation, to go on forever. We will in various settings. We appreciate you joining us, sharing your thoughts in an honest way, in ways that are particularly helpful to our network. Thanks to everybody who joined us today, of course, and again, thanks to Hillary and Sierra for all their help. Please check out the upcoming sessions, which Sierra has just posted, and plan to join us as often as you can. Again, a big thanks to everyone, and we will see you all soon. So long.
Thank you.